Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's always exciting to be in Ukraine. Although, as he said, I'm from California, and I don't know how you live with this weather. You guys should be really promoting global warming, I assume, because then maybe you'll get some decent weather here in Kiev. I'm here to give you some bad news. The bad news is this. The rest of the world out there, the West, America, which I know that many of you look up to, that many of you aspire to be like, the West and America are dying. They're being strangled and killed by Leviathan, by the state, by statism. Freedom is slowly disappearing in much of those countries that have always been a shining city on the hill for many people in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in other places around the world. There is a slow, creeping death occurring in the West. For you guys, the bad news is, not only is there no way to look up to that is disappearing, and Tom talked about the American elections earlier, and I agree with him completely. Never have we had such an evil choice as we have this election. Never have we had such horrible candidates as we have this election. And the scary thing about it is, it could get worse. It could get worse. And whoever wins this is going to make America less free. So not only do you don't have some way to look up to model yourself after, to try to aspire to be, but you also don't have any way to run away from, too, right? You might want to escape Ukraine and go to America. Well, America's on the way to becoming Ukraine. And I agree with Tom as well about the ideas of little libertarian whatever, right? That is not the future. We're not going to be living on little floating islands in international water. Part of the reason for that is that the states that have big ships and big weapons and big bombs are not going to allow you to have an island of freedom in the middle of nowhere. Just imagine you start a bank on this island, and you want to have true privacy on this bank. Immediately going to be accused of what? Money laundering, drug smuggling, all kinds of stuff, and the American Navy is going to show up and shut you down. It's pretty depressing. I should get off now before it gets worse, right? Indeed, I think that the one hope that we have, and the one hope you have, is you. When I look at the world today, I see more excitement about liberty, more excitement about freedom, more excitement about capitalism, more excitement about shrinking the state and bringing freedom in places like Ukraine, in places in Eastern Europe, in places in Latin America than I do in the West. In the West, we're fat, rich, lazy, and complacent. So I'm here to try to convince you to stay, in a sense, and to fight. To fight for your freedom, for your individual freedom, for your individual liberty. Because you have hope. You still remember what real statism, what complete control of human life looks like. You still have in a memory within a generation of what communism is really like. When people say socialism, you know what that looks like. You know what that means. If Bernie Sanders comes to Ukraine and talks about socialism, people know that what he's saying is complete bullshit. In America, what the hell? Just another idea. Right? How bad could it be? Right? They think Denmark is socialist. Right? Denmark is as capitalist as America is. Right? There's no socialism in Denmark. You guys know what socialism really means. So, we got to fight. The state will not go away by itself. You saw earlier today what happens to a good person, and I believe he's a good person, and he probably believes he's a libertarian. But what happens to him once he enters politics? Right? The state has a way of its own of protecting power, of protecting cronyism, of sustaining it and not letting go of the reins, even when people with good intentions come in. They don't usually survive if they're really good. The fight has to be from without. The fight has to be first and foremost an educational fight. You will not win on the political battlefield until you know what you are fighting for, until you have enough troops for the fight, until you have enough people to engage in that struggle, until you, those of us who believe in free markets, can fill that square in Ukraine as Ukrainians did in 2014. Not just from freedom from a corrupt administrator, a corrupt president, but for real freedom, individual freedom, the freedom to live your life as you see fit, free of government control, free of government regulation, free of the state telling you what you can and cannot do in economics, in your private life, in every aspect of your life. That is real freedom. And that's what we should be fighting for. So to do that, we need to educate ourselves. We need to know what freedom is, and we need to educate the people around us. There's vast ignorance in the world. There is ignorance of history. People don't know the graph that Tom Palmer showed earlier of wealth creation, of what capitalism and freedom have brought to the world in a very short period of time. Historically, the last 200 years, a meaningless period of time, just 200 years. And yet almost all the wealth we have today was created during those 200 years. And it was created by one political system. It's called capitalism. It's called freedom. Socialism doesn't create anything. Socialism doesn't build anything. Socialism destroys, it steals, it annihilates, it redistributes. But nothing is built, nothing is created. There's not one successful socialist country in human history. It doesn't stop people from wanting to be socialists, right? What did Einstein call that? When you try to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results? Anybody know what he called that? It's called insanity. And the world is insane because they want to do the same thing over and over again. Socialism, statism, government control, right? And they expect different results. So we have, those of us who believe in free markets, we have history on our side. We have facts on our side. We have examples on our side. Educate yourself about those examples and go out and tell the world. I'll give you an example that's happening right now in the world. About 20 years ago, there was a very, very rich country in Latin America. It was actually the richest country in South America. This country has more oil than Saudi Arabia, more oil reserves in the ground than Saudi Arabia. And it elected a socialist president. And for 20 years, the state has grown and grown and grown and grown. And what has happened to the people of this country? They've gotten poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer. And today, Venezuela is so poor that babies are dying from malnutrition. There is no toilet paper. There is no toothpaste. They have to go to Colombia, not exactly the richest country in the world, in order to buy basic necessities just to survive. Just to survive. The richest country in Latin America became the poorest country in Latin America. But what's interesting about Latin America, what's interesting about South America, is you also have the example about the same period of time where the poorest country in Latin America became the richest. How did that happen? It happened because they adopted free market policies. It happened because they privatized their economy, including their Social Security. Their pension plan was completely privatized. And this country's Chile. And they went from being the poorest country in Latin America to the richest country in Latin America. Now you think that would be a happy story. That would be a wonderful, happy ending. But guess what Chile's doing now? It just elected a president twice who's a socialist and who's undoing all the things that made Chile rich so that they can be poor. Because what we really want is poverty. So the facts, the examples are all on our side. And we need to know them. We need to know the graph. We need to understand what caused it. We need to see and show people what freedom actually achieves, what freedom actually does. And that's just numbers. But freedom is much more than numbers, right? Freedom is about your soul. Freedom is about your life. Freedom is about the choices you make on a day-to-day basis. You don't see that in a graph, but it's all there. The kind of choices we have, the kind of lives we have in a relatively rich, free country as compared to the choices you had just 20, 30 years ago. And what that does to the human spirit. So we have facts. We have history, we got to study them, we got to understand them, and we got to teach the world out there. And if you care about your future, you got to do this. You got to embrace learning, and you got to embrace advocacy. Go out there and get the word out, because it's your lives that depend on it. Second, we've got to understand why freedom works. We've got to understand the foundations for freedom. Economic foundations. You've got to understand the economic foundations. You've got to understand in basic terms why it happens, why a market works. Right? And markets work. They work amazingly well. And we've got to be able to defend markets. And we've got to be able to defend the way they work. So you've got to understand the basics of economics, the basic principles of economics. You don't have to become an economics PhD, but the basic ideas. If you're going to fight for liberty, if you're going to fight for freedom, you got to understand those basic fundamentals. To dismantle this ridiculous idea that the state knows how to use farmland better than you do, if it's yours. That the state has any interest economically in what is your stuff. Central planning has always failed. Central planning cannot work. It cannot work. And again, you should read Hayek, you should read Mises, you should read the great economists that have explained this in great detail. And third, you need to understand the philosophical foundations of freedom. We've got to understand the basic assumptions behind the idea of freedom. And this is where Ayn Rand is so important. This is where Ayn Rand, I think, supplies us with fantastic ammunition to defend the principles of freedom, the principles of free markets, of capitalism, of individual freedom, more than any other thinker. So I encourage you, you've got out there in Ukrainian, you've got copies of Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Read those books. There's some essays on the table in the back by Ayn Rand, which I would highly recommend. Read those. It's really important for us to understand what the foundations of liberty really rest on. And the foundations of liberty rest on the idea that your life, each one of your lives, belongs to you. Your life is yours. It doesn't belong to Ukraine. It doesn't belong to the state. It doesn't belong to your neighbor. It doesn't belong to your family. It belongs to you. You do not have obligations to the state. You do not have obligations to your neighbor. You do not have obligations to your family unless you choose those obligations. You are the unit of moral and political measurement. You as an individual are what are important. When I listen to the land reform panel because I'm interested in kind of these reforms, and I'm interested in the perspectives. But the guy was sitting here was basically talking about the fact that you are just subjects of the Ukrainian state. You are just pieces to be moved by the statist, by Ukraine, as if Ukraine has some kind of mystical meaning. Ukraine is the sum of you as individuals. Your life is yours. Everything starts with that fact. That is the basic assumption behind the founding of the United States of America in 1776. The basic assumption, the thing that makes America special, or at least that made America special, is the idea that for the first time in history, the individual's life was an end in itself. The individual's life was their own end. So you, as an individual, have a right to your own life. You have a right to pursue the values necessary for you to live a successful life, the values you believe are necessary. This is why central planning can never work. This is the fundamental reason. Who knows what's good for you? Only you do. The state cannot get into each one of your minds and decide what is good for you. Therefore, it cannot plan your life. Only you can plan your life. And it's your responsibility to plan your life. So you have a right, an inalienable right that no majority, no state, no group can take away from you. A right to live your life free of coercion, free of force, free of intimidation by others. You have a right to pursue the values you believe are necessary for your life to be successful. You have a right to liberty, which means what? Which means you have a right to think whatever thoughts you want. You have a right to speak. You have a right to write. You have a right to fight for your values. Free of force, free of coercion, free of intimidation. Right? And you have a right to property. Right? Who the hell is Ukraine to tell an owner of land what he can and cannot do with his land? That's called property rights. And those rights are inalienable. Nobody can take them away, even if it's deemed in Ukrainian interests. Who cares what Ukrainian interests are? The question is only, what are my rights? What are my interests as an individual who owns this piece of land? The solution to land reform in Ukraine is easy. Now, I'm sure there are technicalities that are beyond me. Define property rights, have a legal system that protects them, and let legal owners of land do whatever the hell they want with it. The state has no right to designate it agricultural or residential or industrial. If you own the land, it's yours. Do with it what you want. Sell it to the Chinese. That's probably your best bet. I mean, I was invited to the Ukrainian parliament last year, and I had a bunch of politicians, and they asked me, what should we do? You know, the Russians are here, they're attacking us. How do we protect ourselves against the Russians? And I said, it's easy. Get rich. If you get rich, you'll be able to defend yourself. And they said, okay, but how do we get rich? I said, it's easy to get rich. Let me say that again. It's easy to get rich. Hong Kong got rich. Hong Kong had a lot fewer resources than you do. Estonia's getting rich. Poland's richer than you. America got rich. It's easy to get rich. Establish property rights and get out of the way. That's all you have to do. Establish property rights and get out of the way. You need a police, you need a justice system, and you need a military. But other than that, government has no role. Has no role. If you do those things, if you establish property rights, get out of the way, establish the rule of law, you will get rich very quickly. And by the way, I also told them, and they didn't like this, I said, sell everything. Anything that's owned by Ukraine, sell it. Sell it to anybody who wants to buy it. The Germans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Americans. As long as you don't sell it to the Russians, you're okay, right? So, if you think about things qua individual, then it's obvious. What does an individual want? What does an individual need in order to thrive? What does an individual need in order to be successful? He needs freedom. He needs to be left alone. He needs to be free from coercion. He needs to know that the crooks and the cheats and the people who pull out guns are going to go to jail. And except for that, he needs to be left alone. And what happens when individuals are left alone? If they have the right ideas, if they're motivated in the right way, what do? They work, they produce, they create, they make stuff, they build stuff. They create the wealth that makes countries, that makes societies wealthy. It's not society that makes wealth, it's individuals who make it. You want to get rich? Free up individuals. Let them loose. Let the creative talent, the creative spirit of each one of you out there. So getting rich is easy. And we in the West need you guys to be role models for us because we've forgotten how to do it. We're so rich already that we're not worried about how they're getting richer. And that's why the economies in the West are flat. There's stagnation, and nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to care. Right? We're spoiled and lazy. You guys are still poor enough to care. So take advantage of it. Embrace it. So, freedom for the individual. What you need to be able to articulate, what you need to be able to argue, is the morality and justification for individual freedom. That the moral argument for capitalism, the moral argument for free markets is fundamentally an argument for the morality of the individual to pursue his own happiness, to make the most of his own life as an individual. Your moral responsibility, your moral duty, if you will, is to make the most of your life. And get them out of the way so you can do it. Get them out of the way so you can make the most of what you have, of your talents, your abilities, your propensities. So, to fight Leviathan, we need to know stuff. We need to educate ourselves. We need to study. We need to know the basic philosophical case for liberty. We need to know the basic economic case for liberty. And we need to know the historical case for liberty. Luckily, they're all consistent. They all tell the same story. And I agree with Tom. Not everybody needs to know this. Not everybody's going to be a philosopher. Not everybody's going to be an economist. But the people who are going to make the change, the people who are going to bring about the revolution, the people who are going to bring us a free world have to know this stuff. You have to be a little bit of a philosopher, a little bit of an economist, and a little bit of an historian. There is no other option. There's nobody else to do it. You are it. You are the future. You are the revolution. So get busy studying. So that's the first thing you need to do. Second is you got to speak. You got to be active. You got to engage with ideas. You got to let people know that there is an alternative. You can't stay silent. The world will not change if those of us who believe in these ideas do not speak up, do not write. We need to go on television. We need to go in the streets. We need to publish books. We need to write letters to the editor. We need to call in on radio shows. We need to do whatever it takes to get our message out there, to get our message heard. Because all of history is shaped by minorities. All of history is shaped by minorities, intellectual minorities. The communists were never a majority. The founding fathers of America were never a majority. But what they did was A, they understood their ideas, and B, they got busy. They got active. They got engaged. They advocated and advocated and advocated. They wrote and wrote and wrote, and they spoke and they spoke and they spoke. They were not armchair intellectuals. They were intellectuals who were fighting for a cause. And what's a more noble cause than freedom? So study, speak, and finally, and I know most of you are students, but there has to be a businessman or two here in the room. I'm going to give a pitch for the free market organizations in Ukraine. You got to support the people who are doing the fighting. You got to help them out. You got to write them a check. I'm going to do some fundraising, right? Students for Liberty does a great job. European Students for Liberty here does a great job. They're free market organizations here. You got to get engaged in the battle. And engaged in the battle also means writing checks. Also means giving moral support. Right? So, study, speak, support. There's a lot of energy, I feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel there's a lot of energy among Ukrainian young people who want freedom, who want liberty. You want to maximize the effectiveness of that energy. And you want it to grow. You can make a difference. Groups that are much smaller than us have changed the world. Groups with much worse ideas than us have changed the world. We have facts, we have economics, we have history, and we have philosophy behind us. And best of all, we have the noblest idea in human history, the right of the individual to his own life and the creation of a political system whose only job is to protect that life. We have that on our side. So we're going to win. And maybe we start here in Ukraine. So go out there and fight. Thank you.
Thanks.
We got plenty of time for questions. So
yeah, Q&A. So please, a lady in that side.
Hello, thank you for your idea. And I have spotted a slight contradiction in your speech, but
sure.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So you were saying that the free market, let's assume that's US, and then you're saying that...
Let's assume what?
It's US, it's America, no?
No, US is not a free market.
How would you call US then?
So...
What is the free market then?
Okay, so let me answer. All economies in the world today, or most economies in the world today, with maybe an exception or two, are mixed economies. They're a mixture of some freedom and some state. Some countries have a little bit more freedom and a little bit less state, and some countries have a lot more state and a little bit less freedom. But all economies in the world today are mixed economies. There is no free market economy in the world today. There's no country even close to a free market in the world today. And certainly America, one of the most regulated economies in the world, an economic freedom index, the United States today is in the mid-teens, 15, 16, 17, 18. Used to be number 3. So the United States is not a model for economic freedom today. But go ahead with your question.
Okay, then I'm even more confused than I was before. Okay, so my question would be
I would be happy to clarify.
Where are we heading to? I mean, if there is no free market economy, then what are you advocating for?
Well, we want us to create one. The fact that no free market economy exists in the world today should not be a barrier to anything. It's something we should strive towards. It's an ideal that we should fight to create, right? There never used to be a country that voted for its politicians until there was a first country that voted for it. There never used to be democracies until the first democracy was established. There isn't a free market in the world today. Let's create one. We could start with Ukraine.
Okay, they already tried to do that in Chile, no?
What's
But
that?
they tried to do it in Chile, no? With
Yes,
all
and
the
they were very successful. People in Chile went from being very poor to being relatively rich. They didn't finish the job. They should have done a lot more, and they should have made it even more free market. The problem in Chile, as is the problem in all Western countries, and I think here as well, is that they got the economic case for liberty, and they even got the historical case for liberty. What in Chile they don't have, and what you guys don't have, and what America doesn't have, is the philosophical moral case for freedom. So when they got rich in Chile, they got lazy, and they felt guilty for their success, and they started undoing what they had done.
But in the process of privatization in Chile, I'm not sure that Chileans who became, rich, and then the gap between poor and rich were extremely big. So I don't know. Anyway, my question was, you were saying that there is no successful socialist country.
Yes.
I mean, not in a pure sense, but we have China and Singapore, and China is showing one of the best economic growths in the world. So how would that fall into
So that's a good question. But let me first say about Chile that the gap between the rich and the poor is big. Good. Let me say this again. Inequality is a good thing. Why? Because if you look around the room, all of us are different. We have different skills, we have different talents, we have different abilities. When are we the same? When, if we take a bunch of people who are very different, does the results become the same? When we're controlled, when we're unfree. When you let us free, what's going to happen? You'll become an engineer, and you'll become an entrepreneur, and you'll become a teacher. And the entrepreneur will probably make more money than the teacher, and I forget what you were, an engineer is going to become rich, and you're going to have gaps. Cool. Freedom results in inequality. That's a beautiful thing. We're different. The world would be horrible if we were all the same. So I love gaps. I love inequality. I think it's terrific. I think countries that have a lot of inequality, typically, it's a sign that they are free countries. You know what inequality was like 300 years ago? How many people were poor 300 years ago? Almost everybody, 98%. You know what the Gini coefficients are, the way to measure inequality? There was almost no inequality 300 years ago because everybody was poor. There were a few aristocrats up here, but they didn't really count because there were few of them. Everybody's poor. And they go along and everybody's poor, and then suddenly this happens. Everybody becomes rich, but these guys become much richer. Who cares? But it's more than who cares. The guys became much richer by doing what? How do you become rich? Goes back to my question earlier. How do you become rich? By producing stuff that everybody wants. Why do they want it? Because it makes them richer. I'll give you an example, and then I'll answer your question. I'll give you an example. How many read Harry Potter? Harry Potter? No Harry Potter in Ukraine? You can raise your hand. How many of you read Harry Potter? I read Harry Potter. I loved Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, is a billionaire. She used to be a welfare. Now she's a billionaire. Oh my God. Income inequality grew. This is horrible. Because, you know, I read Harry Potter. I have 2 sons. And every copy of Harry Potter books, I had to buy 2 copies because they both wanted to read it, right? And then I also bought it on audio so I could listen to it. And then I went to every movie. So I spent, by my calculation, about $1,000 on Harry Potter. I got poorer by $1,000 and J.K. Rowling became a billionaire. That's not fair. Really? Did I really get poorer by $1,000? Why did I buy Harry Potter? Because my life got better by buying Harry Potter. Because I enjoyed the books. Because it was fun. Because I got incredible value from Harry Potter. So am I glad? Am I sad or happy that J.K. Rowling is a billionaire? I'm happy. Very happy that she wrote Harry Potter, that so many of us got pleasure out of Harry Potter, that our lives are spiritually better because we read Harry Potter. And yes, she's a billionaire. Good for her. So there's income inequality. Great. I love it. What about China? So China's a fascinating story. China, in 1978 and in the early 1980s, took a few places around China and said, we're going to run some experiments. We're going to leave you alone. We're not going to regulate you. We're not going to control you. Do whatever you want. Not the whole of China, just certain areas in China. And guess what happened? Boom, people created incredible amounts of wealth. You go to South China, to Guangzhou and Dongguan and Shenzhen, and you see skyscrapers and you see incredible amounts of wealth. Cities that didn't exist in 1982 today have 10, 12 million people living in them. Why? Because there was no socialism in those places because they were left alone. The places were controlled, where the state stayed in control of, you don't have to hold your hand forever, we'll get to our questions. Where the state actually controlled are still dirt poor. The wealth in China has been created by private entrepreneurs. But you know who's making China poorer than it would have otherwise been? State companies that are still being subsidized and controlled by the state. So China is a beautiful illustration of the failure of socialism and the success of freedom. When you allow free markets even a little bit, even under controlled environments, they blossom. And when you control areas, they shrivel and die. And of course, the biggest experiment of socialism was China under Mao, where 60 million people died of starvation. Socialism is a recipe for death and starvation, nothing more. Singapore is not socialist. Singapore, by the Economic Freedom Index, is the #2 freest country on the planet. #1 is Hong Kong, #2 is Singapore, #3, by the way, is New Zealand. So if you're going to escape anywhere, I would go to New Zealand. It's a beautiful place. So Singapore is a capitalist. Now, it's controlled, but what do they control? Not the economy. They control whether you chew gum in the streets. They control, there's no free speech. So that's bad. Economics is only one aspect of life, right? We want freedom. We want freedom, social freedom. We want personal freedom, and we want economic freedom. We want all kinds of, all freedoms for the individual. Singapore has one mixture. China has another mixture. And China, by the way, is still relatively poor relative to the United States and relative to other countries. The great thing about the US was a long time ago, it was very free, and we created huge amounts of wealth because of that freedom. Okay, that was a very long answer.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hello, my name's Alex, and I've been itching to ask you this question. So,
I can tell you've been.
We've heard the main message is that the capitalism is good, socialism is bad. And when we say the country is rich, would you agree that it means that the middle class, it has strong middle class?
No, I don't believe that.
Well, okay.
I don't think in terms of classes. I don't think in terms of.
But let me remind you that in the 60s and the 50s, the U.S. used elements of socialism to redistribute the wealth, to tax the rich by 90%, so that people could have affordable houses in 2 years, pay mortgage which is affordable. So my question is, don't you think that both capitalism can go awry and wrong, and socialism can go wrong when they lose the morale? when they lose the ground under their feet and go extreme ways.
Okay.
So extreme capitalism and extreme socialism are bad, and what we need is some kind of balance. That was my question.
No. Socialism is poison. Even a little bit of it kills you slowly. Even a little bit. Now, I would expect that question in the United States, and I get it all the time, not in Ukraine, because the answer is technical and it relates to American history. But the fact is, the 1950s and 60s were not some utopia in America. Nobody actually paid 90% income tax. The effective rate was much lower because there were so many loopholes that nobody paid that tax. It's a mythology. But beyond that, while the economy grew relatively fast in the 60s after JFK cut taxes, that growth, because of the socialist elements in the American economy, led to the inflation and the stagnation of the 1970s, which destroyed much of American prosperity. People don't remember how bad things were in the 1970s. And the United States was only revived economically when Ronald Reagan became president and did a little bit. He didn't do a lot, unfortunately. Just did a little bit of deregulation and cutting taxes, and the economy took off. But look, the United States hasn't been a free market since 1913. And even then, it was only 90% free or 95% free. It wasn't all the way. No. Capitalism, to the extent that it is tried, works, but more than that. Socialism is morally offensive, morally evil, because socialism at its basic assumption says you as an individual belong to the state, belong to the collective, belong to the proletarian, fill in the blank, but you don't belong to you. That idea of collectivism, that idea of ownership of an external group on your life is wrong. It is evil. Capitalism is moral because it is the only system that recognizes your sovereignty over yourself. It's the only system that recognizes that you belong to you, that your life is yours to live as you see fit, pursuing the rational values that you need in order to be successful. So you can't have a little bit of evil. This is why we should strive for capitalism, not a mixture. Mixtures, this is what Europe has, and they have no economic growth, and they're dying. They're literally dying. They're getting old. There's no future in a mixed economy.
Thank you. Can we have the gentleman? Не, сюда ближе.
Okay, thanks. In the current presidential election in the United States, which economic program you support more, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? For example, Hillary is for free trade, but he said that United States needs taxation.
So let me answer the question, right? So that question is like asking me, what would you rather die of? Cancer or heart disease? Hillary Clinton wants to tax and regulate us to death. Donald Trump wants to isolate us from trade and build walls to death, right? It doesn't matter. And by the way, I don't trust him on taxes and I don't trust him on regulations. Right? So I don't even trust what he says, so-called good stuff that he wants. Both are statists. Both believe in the state. Donald Trump has not said a word about government spending, about reducing entitlement, about privatizing entitlements, nothing, right? I don't believe he would move us any closer to free markets than she would. They would just do it differently, right? And by the way, I can't think of a more suicidal thing to do than raise tariffs, particularly in the context of the United States. The last president of the United States who was a businessman and who raised tariffs was Hoover. And raising tariffs spun the entire world into a Great Depression. So beware.
We have very active part only this side, so please give the mic.
You guys don't want to ask questions, only those guys do? Oh, you're socialist.
On the left.
You're on that left. You're on my right. Although nobody's on my right, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. And I would like to ask a question. I think that the most dangerous enemy of ideas of liberty is not state, but the ideas that lay behind them.
Yes.
I mean leftist ideas or cultural Marxism.
Yes.
And we have a very weird situation when in America, in the most successful example of economic growth and political growth, we have a situation when a huge part of students of academic society support such leftist ideas. They support Bernie Sanders, for example.
Yeah.
And how can this situation occur? I don't understand.
How can this situation what? Happen?
Happen in America, yes.
Yeah. So I agree with you. The battle ultimately is a battle of ideas. It's not about the state. It's about the ideas that make the state possible. But it's more fundamental than the ideas of Marxism. Marxism is one application of something much deeper.
I mean all leftist ideas.
No, but it's not left or right, because the deeper ideas are held on the right as well as they are on the left. The fundamental ideological challenge that we face is between collectivism and individualism. It is between reason and mysticism. In epistemology, reason and mysticism. In politics, collectivism and individualism. In ethics, it's what should you live for, yourself or others? And then fill in the blank who the others are. Those are the fundamental ideas. We can then fill in fascism, socialism, Marxism. They all fit on the side of collectivism, mysticism, and living for others. The problem in America, and this is, unfortunately this is going to be a long answer, but the problem in America is that the founding fathers got the politics right. They got the idea of individualism right. They rejected collectivism. They rejected statism, and they stood by the individual. But there has never been a philosophical defense since the Enlightenment, since the 18th century, of reason and of moral individualism, of egoism. And until we have that defense, we will continue to lose. If you believe that morally you owe an obligation as a primary to others, statism will always win. If you believe in epistemology, I'm getting technical, right? That mysticism is the way we know the world. It's all about intuition. It's all about revelation. We will always lose. Why? Because if mysticism is the way to truth, then how many of you commune with the spirits? We don't. We need an expert. We need a philosopher king. We need a pope. We need some spiritual leader to guide us. We need to be told how to live. That's what religion has always done. Told us how to live because we don't know for ourselves. What reason has done is liberated the individual to decide for himself what is good for him without the need of authority. So what we need is to liberate ourselves from mysticism, liberate ourselves from otherism, the idea that our purpose in life is to live for others, and rid ourselves of collectivism. And in my view, and I'm biased, in my view, but I'm also right, in my view, the only thinker that has taken these ideas on head on and straightforward and provided an alternative answer is Ayn Rand. And that's why I encourage you to read Ayn Rand. And you see, from the founding fathers, until Ayn Rand, there were no philosophers. The American philosophers were terrible. People like James Dewey and others were awful. Where they were statists, they were collectivists, and they were not individualistic. There was no foundation laid for the ideas of liberty. And this is why it hasn't only failed in America over time. Now remember, it lasted 200 years. So the founders did a pretty good job, right? But it's failing all over the West because we don't have the philosophical defense of capitalism. That's what we need. That's what Ayn Rand has provided. Let's study it, embrace it, and go out there and fight.
Thank you.
Окей, якщо хтось хоче запитати українською, будь
If somebody wants to ask you a question in Ukrainian, please do. We do have a translation. Or
that side. So, please stand up.
Так, що ж, доброго дня. Ви багато
good morning.
You said a lot about fighting for freedom and freedom at any cost. And you brought some examples from Chile, from Singapore. How justified is to use the instrument of force and unfreedom for achievement of freedom? And a very connected question to this. How much time do you think Ukraine will survive without using the traditional democratic methods of free market before it will sink into the maw of socialism populism, which we're on the way to?
So it's a great question. And I'll just repeat it. When is it justified to use force in order to achieve freedom like they did in Chile and like they do in Singapore? Ultimately, never. It's never right. But look, Pinochet was in power not to bring economic freedom. Pinochet rose to power in Chile because he wanted to rule Chile. But he was failing from an economic perspective. So he approached some economists who by chance, complete chance, were good. And he implemented some good strategies and it worked, right? But it's never right to say, Ludwig von Mises, in my view, the greatest economist ever. Ludwig von Mises was once asked, what would be the first thing you would do if you were dictator of the world? You were the top guy, you could do anything. What would be the first thing you would do? And you know what his answer was? Resign. Because you cannot bring freedom by force. It's not right, and it doesn't last, as maybe Chile is a good example of it. The second question, how long does Ukraine have before it succumbs to socialism or populism or something else? I don't know. I don't know enough about your economy. I don't know enough about your country to be able to give you a timeline. I don't know how long America is going to survive, never mind how long Ukraine is going to survive. So specifying timelines is not a good policy. It's very dangerous. But let me make this one point about populism. I again agree with Tom Palmer. I'm agreeing too much with Tom. I'm going to have to check my premises. Socialism in many respects is dead. In many respects, socialism is no longer the enemy because socialism has been discredited. It doesn't work anywhere. Nobody likes socialism except in the United States because they're too ignorant to know how bad socialism is. What's really dangerous are two phenomena: populism and cronyism. And both disguise themselves as if they're pro-capitalist. It's like Donald Trump, I'm a businessman, so I'm pro-markets. No, the fact that he's a businessman doesn't give him any qualifications for anything other than to run a business, and I'm not sure how good he is at that even. But populism and cronyism are the real enemies that we have to watch for. You're not going to get a explicitly socialist movement in Ukraine. You're much more likely to get a nationalist, populist movement or the continuation of what you have, which is corruption and cronyism. And those need to be fought, and you can only fight those with an alternative. And in our case, luckily, we have an alternative, which is freedom, property rights, individualism.
So we have one question.
Oh, this side.
At least here, at last.
Maxim Yali, PhD in political science.
Are you asking in English or?
Yeah, English.
Oh, English, okay. Well, let me keep him.
Thank you for your very emotional presentation. But nevertheless, the first question from the left side, we're not socialists, but anyway, how would you explain such a phenomenon that in Ukraine, since 1991 we're independent, free market, post-communist country, but still minus 35% GDP as it was in 1989. And the best progress in economy was exactly when President Kuchma was due to statistics and state-controlled and influence of state was done.
Yeah.
First point. Second point, actually, you are still a bit manipulating facts, concerning China. Particularly, there are a lot of companies which are in top 100 of the world, state-controlled, definitely. So maybe it's about the balance between state and free market. What you say, all economies are mixed. And the last one, financial crisis in US, was exactly happened in 2008 after Wall Street, was absolutely uncontrolled, free market, etc., etc. And that's what it led to.
Okay, so let me start with what I know well, which is the 2008 financial crisis. Thank you for asking that. I'm a finance guy. I'm a PhD in finance. This is stuff I know. In 2007, well, let me backtrack. 3 industries failed in 2008. Banks, mortgages, real estate. Those are the 3 industries, right? These 3 industries are the most regulated, most controlled industries in the United States without any question. So it's not an accident those failed. Now you say Wall Street was cowboys and Indians on Wall Street in 2007. That is insane. That is just not true. Wall Street is regulated, so regulated. You know how many government officials go to work at JP Morgan every single day? Government officials. At the bank, in 2007, how many government officials went to work at JP Morgan every single day? Over 100. They were so controlled and regulated. Everything a bank does in the United States requires government approval, regulatory approval. The United States has no freedom in Wall Street. Wall Street is controlled and regulated like no other industry in the United States. And what controlled the mortgage business? Freddie and Fannie, 2 entities created by government, protected by government. Their bonds were at the same interest as government bonds. Why? Because everybody knew that their bonds would be backed up by the governments, because they are government entities. I have a big mortgage. I have a huge mortgage in the United States. You know why? I love mortgages. You know why? Because I get a tax deduction on my mortgage. Why do I get a tax deduction? Because the government has decided to encourage me to take a mortgage. Government is everywhere in housing, is everywhere in mortgages, is everywhere in banking. The 2008 crisis was a crisis of government, a crisis of regulation, a crisis of central planning. And I'll add one element to the crisis which is crucial, and those of you who know Austrian economics will appreciate this. When you hold interest rates, as the Federal Reserve did in 2002, below the rate of inflation for 2.5 years, you create malinvestments, you create bubbles. So we had a bubble, and it burst. A bubble created by the Federal Reserve, a government institution, not by Wall Street. And it had to burst. Bubbles always burst. Why did the bubble go into housing? Because the government wanted it to go into housing. Because the government incentivized people to go into housing. And the government also told the banks, you're too big to fail. So if you make money, keep it. And if you lose money, we'll bail you out. That's not capitalism. That's not free markets. That's all statism. The 2008 crisis, just like the American Great Depression, were caused by Federal Reserve and government policies. They were caused by the Great Depression was caused by Smoot-Hawley, the trade, and by the Federal Reserve, just like the 2008 crisis. And this is not me speculating. In 5-10 years, every economist in the United States will admit it. Today, they're too partisan not to. Now, the other 2 questions, Ukraine, 1989 today, I don't know enough to explain it. But let me say this. Yeah. Let me say this, when you're very statist and poor, and today you're still very statist and poor, the differences are not that big in terms of the amount of freedom in the economy, and the differences are not that big in terms of the wealth. If you want to become rich, it's easy. It really is. Completely privatize the economy, not a little bit, not a piece here and a piece there. I don't know what impact those have. Sometimes you create more distortions by privatizing this and not this and doing it in the wrong order. Privatize it all. Not a little bit, and it's not an issue of balance. And yes, let's put everything on the table, right? Most economists in the world, particularly those who have Nobel Prizes, disagree with me. Most economists in the world are wrong. Most economists in the world ignore facts, ignore reality, ignore history. But if you study history, if you study economies, what you will see is economies like the Czech Republic, like Estonia, that move fast, that privatize quickly, that reduce the size of the government fast, they eliminate corruption, economic growth goes way faster. Poland today is richer than Ukraine. Why? Because they privatized quicker than you did. But Poland is poor relative to the Czech Republic. Why? Because the Czech Republic did even faster than Poland. You want to stay poor? That's fine. I don't care, right? I'm just a visitor here. Keep the policies you have today, the corruption, the cronyism, the state control of land, the state control of industries. That's how you stay poor throughout all of history. This isn't emotionalism. These are the facts. And the 2008 crisis proves that even in an advanced economy like the United States, when the government starts meddling, they create enormous damage. Private markets never cause systemic risk like 2008. No bank is big enough to cause systemic risk like the Federal Reserve can, like Freddie and Fannie, government institutions can, like tax policy that affects everybody can. Yes, a bank would fail here, a bank would fail there, but you don't get systemic risk unless the government is involved. It's exactly the same thing. In the Great Depression, 90% of economists agree with me. There's no contradiction in the Great Depression anymore. There's no disagreement. Even people like conventional economists today believe that the Great Depression was caused primarily by bad Federal Reserve policies, and then Smoot-Hawley, which raised tariffs. And if you look at FDR's policies, government spending, government involvement, the Great Depression was just as bad in 1937 as it was in 1933 when he took office. And indeed, World War II just made it even worse. People were poorer during World War II. What changed, what got the economy going again, was after World War II, reducing government controls, getting the government out of the economy, and the soldiers coming home motivated to go to work. And the fact that the rest of the world needed building and the United States was the only country that wasn't completely devastated, right? But the Great Depression was caused by government. Nobody questions that anymore. Most economics books today will say that the Federal Reserve, Milton Friedman and Schwartz wrote this big book about the history of that period, and it showed the Federal Reserve and what it did. And that's just economic fact now. It's not even opinion. 2008, it'll take some time for the consensus to build. But the Great Depression, I know in history classes they still teach, the market failed. There was no market failure. There was a small recession caused by the collapse of the stock market that turned into depression because of government policies.
We have time for the last question.
Okay.
And I suggest to you to decide who will ask.
Well, let's take that guy in the back there. Sorry, I had to choose somebody.
Thank you. I have a question of immigration problem. Yes, right now Europe has to gain people from Syria, from other countries. Yes, but this makes a big problem for us for high educated countries. And America chose the way to take a green card, 500,000 a year, if I'm not mistaken. What is the right way for our countries and for the world itself for the problem of immigration? Thank you.
Wow, that's the last question, huh?
For 15 minutes.
So my view is that immigration should be freer in the United States, that the United States is much too restrictive in terms of immigration. And as long as you have a welfare state, what you should do is anybody who can come, anybody who can show they've got a job should be given the ability to come into the country. So the idea of building walls and restricting immigration is a losing idea. Donald Trump is a loser for having that idea, right? I love calling Donald Trump a loser. But so what you want generally, put aside the Islamic immigration, I'll get to that in a minute. What you want generally is more immigration, not less immigration. Immigrants fuel economic growth. Immigrants do jobs people don't want to do. And they become entrepreneurs and they build. And if you have a culture that is self-confident, that believes in what it stands for, in freedom, for example, in individualism, then the immigrants assimilate. They become part of your culture. They adopt your culture. And that's what you want. You want a confident culture that believes in freedom, that believes in individualism, and demands that immigrants assimilate into that culture. And if you have that, I'm not afraid of immigrants. Bring them on. Now, the Islamic immigrants are special because there's a war going on. Now, in the West, we don't want to acknowledge that there's a war. We pretend there isn't one. And we bury our heads in the sand, or we evade the fact that there's a war. But there's a war. There are radical Islamists over there in the Middle East who want to kill us or convert us to Islam. They really believe that they want to take over the whole world and impose Muslim theology on all of us. So my view is, there's a war. Let's go and win it. Let's destroy these radical Islamists. While we're at war, you don't accept immigrants from the party that you're at war with. So I'm fine with blocking immigration from Muslim countries while the war is going on. But let's do it in a way that we win the war and we can get on with life and open up our borders and have new immigrants come in. So as long as there's a war, it's problematic importing large numbers of radical Muslims. But let's win the war. The war is winnable. That's a different topic and a different time. I'd be happy to tell you how to win the war. I've got a book on it called Winning the Unwinnable War. It's on Amazon. It's called Winning the Unwinnable War. It's not hard to win the war, just like it's not hard to be rich. But it takes will. And it takes identifying who the enemy is, which most people in the West refuse to do. So if we win the war, I'm for open immigration. And you got to get rid of the welfare state because you don't want people coming in just to get welfare. But anybody who has a job should be allowed to come in. Anybody who's going to work for a living should be allowed to come in. Immigrants are great. America was built on immigrants. I'm an immigrant. How could I be against immigration? I love immigrants, partially because I like myself. Right.
Thank you
all.